ironically, now within 1 year, 2 connections emerged for me with the Hungarian space ecosystem. So this conference is one, but also thanks to Peter, and Peter can be a very persistent guy, he convinced me to join. I was invited, I accepted to join the International Advisory Board of the Space Lab at Obuda University, and I think there's some alumni of Obuda around here, and I'm very thrilled with that role as well. It's Hungary, there's obviously, I'm probably going to miss a lot of people, I apologize for that, but even for someone who doesn't know a lot about it, there's some clear space references, right? So we're going above the common line, right? And it's like most people forget about it, right? And then I'm a big science fiction nerd, and I was discussing a book yesterday. It was called basically the Bobbyverse series, and that's all about von Neumann probes, von Neumann, right? And then we have more recent examples like Charles Simonyi, right? I think flew to space twice, obviously also born Hungarian. But in any event, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm also very thankful to Peter for giving me the speaking spot right after lunch. This is the best speaking slot. So one of my degrees is in psychology, and just bear with me 1 minute. You may not know there's actually academic research, I think it was done in Israel. They looked at judges like condemning people, like the rate at which they're condemning people during various times of the day. And right before lunch, there's a statistically much higher chance of being condemned than right after lunch. Right, so I'm quite happy that I'm after lunch here, and you will bear with me. Okay, but so let's actually get to the topic. I've been asked here to give a 10-15-minute lead-in to the Space and Defense panel, and I shall do that. And Space and Defense, that intersection, that seems to be a big topic these days. And I'm kind of bemused. It was like, why? Space has always been intertwined with defense. I mean, that's literally how it started. So I'm a born German, so I'm painfully aware that the first human object to cross the common line was a German A4 rocket, or unfortunately better known as the V2 missile, which wreaked havoc and death mostly on London and Antwerp. So that's the origin of the space sector, right? And as Wernher von Braun, who obviously went on to become the father of the Apollo program in many ways, said at the time, like, well, the V2 worked perfectly, but it landed on the wrong planet. And then I guess he spent the rest of his life trying to correct that. And then, of course, I mean, you're probably all aware, this... Is this better? Or this is much better? Okay. I heard you. I hope you actually heard what I was saying until this point. Okay, I was talking about sort of how space and defense is a big topic now, but it's always been intertwined, right, since the German V2 missile, right? And then obviously, both the Soviets and the Americans took the V2 engineers to the Soviet Union and to the US. And the first rockets we have were basically modified intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? And where Yuri Gagarin sat on top of the Vostok, I mean, that was basically, I think it was an R7, that was a modified ICBM. And where he said, usually that would have carried a nuclear warhead. And then we started doing satellites. And obviously the first satellites, among the first satellites, were spy satellites, right? And that never changed, right? And then came the space shuttle, and the space shuttle, many people don't notice, it was meant to have many, many use cases, and it wasn't just delivering satellites. There was actually plans for the space shuttle that you could use the cargo bay and the grappling arm to actually steal enemy satellites. I think they never did that. But anyway, so space and defense obviously historically has been intertwined all along. But so why is it suddenly becoming sort of a more visible theme again now? And as Peter mentioned in his introduction, I think one big reason is the Ukraine war. Obviously very aware that the Ukrainian border, I think, is only a few hundred kilometers from here. And you probably remember even before the Ukraine war started, but there was this posturing going on. What happened I think it was in November, before the war started. The war started in February, but November before, Russia conducted an anti-satellite test, right? And that was a clear demonstration of power. Then, on the first day of the war, Ukrainian satellite terminals were hacked, presumably by the Russians, right? So that kind of brought it really home, that like link between the terrestrial war and space. And then I think that link became ever more visible to whoever wasn't aware of it before, how important space is in that terrestrial war effort, right? So the use of GNSS, of global navigation systems, right, to guide our weapons on both sides, to be honest. The use of Earth observation imagery, including for many commercial companies now, not only government satellites, in this war effort. And again, even in the run-up to the war, there was commercial companies like showing the Russian troops moving towards the border, right, and in quite great detail. I remember, like, at some point in time, I forget which commercial company it was, but they said, like, oh, we seem to see, like, tanks which have extra space in the back, and that seems to be for, like, blood reserves. And then, yeah, so Earth observation, global navigation systems, and of course, satellite communications. Everyone is sort of aware of the role that Starlink played, or is playing in the Ukraine war. So this is where, you know, should be evidently clear to everyone that space is crucially important to warfare on Earth, right? And then the latest example of that would be, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, is the US Golden Dome, which is a very exciting, very interesting thing. But it's not only space for warfare on Earth. I think it's going to be increasingly also space for, let's call it warfare, for lack of a better word, in space as well. And so what do I mean by that? At least a couple of points. One is these very critical satellites, right? The satellites that enable satellite navigation, remote sensing, communications. They're obviously critical strategic assets, right? This is why Russia and other countries are testing anti-satellite weapons, right? So those need to be protected if you want to be able to engage in efficient warfare, because your adversaries will try to sabotage them. Well, sabotage them or maybe even destroy them, right? Destroying is a little bit harsher, right? Because then probably would commit an outright act of war. But sabotaging, I don't have any security clearance, but as far as I can tell, that's going on every day. Like well, I assume probably on both sides, satellites are being, for example, the sensors are blinded with lasers. Very close inspections of government satellites are being done by other government satellites. So this is, you know, the first relevance of defense in space itself. So not just for warfare on Earth, but basically as an extension, as a consequence. The other thing, though, why I believe defense is going to become more and more relevant for space in space is the following. If all goes well, and I'm a space venture capitalist, right? I invest because I want to see a really thriving in-space economy. I want to see things like space stations manufacturing products in microgravity, better products in microgravity for use on Earth. I want to see space-based solar power. I want to see space-based data centers, all of this, right? But if we actually manage to do that, that means an ever-increasing amount of economic value and also strategic value, if you think about power plants and data centers, is going to be located in space. And again, that has to be protected in the same way that we are protecting strategic economic assets on the world's oceans, for example, right? And so in that way, actually, I see the role of a force like the US Space Force. I very often see them sort of having a similar role as the US Navy and other navies on the world oceans, protecting what's going on there, like protecting economic activity and protecting the freedom to trade, so to say. And then ultimately, I think the defense angle of space may also extend to space resources. So this is obviously a little bit further in the future, but we're all aware there are some potentially quite valuable things in space, whether that's helium-3 on the lunar surface or certain asteroids which are loaded with interesting metals. And it's conceivable that we start fighting over some of those. I hope not, because there seems to be an abundance, but it's not inconceivable either, because obviously on Earth, very often we're fighting over raw materials. Okay, so I think this is like the relevance of space for me to defense. So relevance to Earth-based warfare, but then increasingly also just for space itself. Now, why is this all exciting, or relevant, I should say, to an investor like myself? Well, I don't know what to say. There's so many examples, but we can invest in so many things here, right? So these strategic satellites, whether they're for navigation, Earth observation, communications I talked about, someone has to manufacture those satellites, right? And actually what's increasingly happening right now is that more and more countries are saying, well, we don't just want someone to manufacture those satellites, we want to actually ideally want someone from our country or from our region to do that, and then we want to operate that ourselves, like so-called sovereign satellite constellations, right? And so this increase in government demand is one reason we've recently seen some very big financing rounds for satellite companies like Apex or K2 in the US or Aerospace Lab in Europe. Then you need to launch the satellites, right? So you can invest in launch companies. And in launch companies, you have the same sort of the same sort of sovereign consideration emerging as well, that countries saying, oh, we don't want to rely on someone else, of course they usually mean SpaceX, to launch these satellites. We want to have our own sovereign launch provider. That's actually a little bit of a double-edged sword. I'm kind of quite cynical about it. I'm personally not investing in launch companies because I think the consequence of that type of thinking, especially here in Europe, or the potential risk of this type of thinking is that it's just totally going to fragment. And you're going to end up with a bunch of launch companies in individual countries, none of which has actually a commercial market that's big enough. And I'm old enough to remember when countries had similar sovereignty thinking about airlines, and every country thought they needed to have their own airline, and they all went bankrupt, basically. That didn't turn out so well. So a bit more careful on the launch companies. Then you need launch sites, right, to launch these rockets, and there's some commercial launch sites now. Then you need the sophisticated payloads on the satellites, like, for example, the sensor packs, so we can invest in that as well. We can also invest in satellite components, of course, by the way, like propulsion systems, and we have done that. You need like a communications, command, control for all of these things to talk to each other. And so we invest in that. We are very interested, for example, in optical communications at the moment. And then there's some funkier stuff like newer advanced propulsion technologies. So we actually, this sounds crazy, but we actually have a nuclear fusion propulsion startup in our portfolio. Hypersonics, which is basically advanced space technology. And really funky stuff like people building in-space depots in orbit where you could like store stuff, which you could then, via re-entry vehicles, deploy on demand very rapidly within a few hours to any point on Earth. And so if you think about it, that's highly relevant for military logistics, right? Because you could have a weapons cache in orbit and you deploy that to a theater literally within a few hours, right? So it's really quite interesting. And then the last example I give there of a funkier thing is space-based solar power, which I also personally believe is going to start as a military application because that's where you have the least price sensitivity. I don't think we're going to have really widely used space-based solar power as an alternative, say, to nuclear power plants or something, because the cost would have to be very low. But for the military, you don't have this price sensitivity. So I give you a fact that many of you may not know. The top reason for KIAs, for killed in action, of soldiers dying in the Iraq war for the US, was soldiers being killed by IEDs, explosive devices, while they were guarding diesel transports. Right? Diesel transports, obviously, to be fuel for energy. So if you could beam solar power directly into a theater, that's hugely relevant, and the military would be willing to pay quite a bit for that. So anyway, all of these things I'm describing, governments are seeing that, and this is why we're seeing increasing budgets in most parts of the world, right? So here in Europe, you're probably all aware, the German Minister of Defense came out a couple of weeks ago or so and suddenly said, we're gonna spend 35 billion euros on space-based defense stuff through 2030. That's a huge amount for Germany and for Europe. Very exciting. I mean, we have to see how they're actually going to deploy that. I believe it when I see it, but it sounds very good. In the US, of course, you may be aware that the US Space Force budget is already bigger than the NASA budget. And that's even before the cuts were made to NASA, right? And of course, the US Space Force is not the only defense and intelligence-related entity spending in the US on space. There's many others. And I already mentioned the Golden Dome. So that's the nationwide missile defense shield. And that's, for us as investors, really exciting because that's basically all space technology, right? You need sensors to detect the missile launches. You need interceptors. And right now, the assumption is that those are going to be space-based interceptors. And again, you need command and control to connect all of that. And the White House estimate for the cost of the Golden Dome was $175 billion from memory, which I think no one believed. And then the latest estimate I've seen was the American Enterprise Institute, that's a think tank in DC, and they had a wide range, because it really depends what the architecture is going to be, but their range was $252 billion to $3.6 trillion I personally believe it's going to be more in the trillions. But this is all money for space. I mean, it's obviously over many years, but still very exciting from an investor point of view. And there's many other countries. Japan is talking about many sovereign satellite constellations. We have 2 investments in India, one shared with Ankit here from Riceberg. Both of our Indian companies have already received DRDO, so that's their defense ministry contracts. Even the country where I live, Switzerland, they have just announced a few days ago 850 million francs additional spending on space defense. And it's not just the government. Private investors like myself are also getting excited about space and defense. So in the US, we had 3 arguably successful space IPOs this year. In chronological order, Carmen Space and Defense, Voyager Technologies, and Firefly, a launch company. And if you talk to the investment bankers, they're all very clear that those IPOs attracted good demand because they all have a clear defense angle as well. Other space stocks with such dual-use characteristics have also done very well. At my fund, at E2MC of Thomas Capital, we have over 30 portfolio companies. Almost every single one is dual-use. We arguably have 2 companies which I can't even in good faith say they're dual-use. They're arguably single-use military. It's Polaris, which ultimately wants to do space planes. It's a German company, but in the near term is going to be subsonic, supersonic, and hypersonic drones, autonomous drones. And we have a company in the US called Spectre Aerospace, which is a lot stealthier, but that's basically an air-breathing hypersonic missile, so that there's no dual use there. Now, in Europe, though, we still have to see how things are going to work out. We're going to have a company like Polaris, for example, will start raising a relatively large Series A, and we have to see whether we're going to find the same amount of later stage capital than we have available in the US. But fingers crossed. In that context, though, one reason you still hear a lot in Europe is like, why is there not as much money around for defense? Is that some funds just have outright restrictions and don't want to invest in defense. I think that's improving, but you still see that a lot. And I was at an event in the UK a year and a half ago, and there was a former defense minister. And he, in my mind, said it best. He basically said, he looked at everyone in the room. There was many family offices who refused to invest in defense. And he said, you guys who are not investing in defense, you're living your life securely on the back of those of us who do. And I fully agree with that. Okay, but following up on that note, how do we feel about the space and defense investing? So again, as I said at the beginning, space has always been intertwined with defense. Let me also be very clear. Everyone I know, no one actually wants a war in orbit, right? That would be, at the moment at least, catastrophic because all of our activity is concentrated in the orbits. And so we literally would risk destroying our access to space. So nobody wants that, and that's why it's important that we have this clear deterrence, that everyone, the other side knows that we know what they're doing, and that we can do something about that. But let me finish maybe on an optimistic note among all of this. So a lot of this is obviously driven by geopolitical strategic competition, and mostly between the US and China at the moment. And I want to go back to Wernher von Braun. And so after the moon landing, at some point in time, there was a TV interview with Wernher von Braun on US TV. And they asked him, Dr. von Braun, wouldn't it have been better, or what would have happened that instead of having the space race between the US and the Soviet Union, what if we just had worked together? And without hesitating, Wernher von Braun said, no one would have gone to the moon. So I'll stop on this slightly controversial note, and now we have a panel. Thank you very much.
Raphael has had already his possibility to make an intro. So now I would like to ask Dom, Ankit, and last but not least Imre to just say a few words about you, the organization you represent, and what is your investment thesis. Who is your target audience when it comes to investments?
Hey, I'm Dom. I spent 10 years working in geopolitical risk management and became an accidental founder of a space biotech company, Delta Biosciences. Somewhere along the way, I helped build a dual-use deep tech venture capital fund for pre-seed and seed. And I currently focus on my company and on launching our first space medicine missions. But my hobby is EBAN, and European Business Angel Network is a kind of an extracurricular club where a lot of people just come for a hobby and exchange deal flow and build syndicates. So we look at founders who have a dual-use proposition, some purely kinetic, some purely space-oriented, but we look at good people who have an interesting insight, who have validated their progress somehow, and we build syndicates with other venture capital funds. And one deal we did with Starflight Dynamics in Germany, we've onboarded over €1.2 million with a strategic partner called Co-Invest Capital, and we're currently raising another round for a company called PD Kinematics, and also in partnership with this fund. So early stage, pre-seed, tickets, angels plus VCs up to $1 million or so.
Great. So I'm Ankit, one of the founding partner of Iceberg Ventures. So we invest in deep tech startup globally, early stage. So we are always a lot of time happy to be the first check investor, like right after angels normally. So there is never too early to talk to us. So that's a point that we take pride in doing that. Primarily what we look for breakthrough technologies. So any sector that within deep tech, we look for a technology that doesn't exist, requires, let's say, strong R&D or engineering to solve it. And if you solve it, then you can actually disrupt an existing value chain by a significant factor like 4 or 5x, or even create a whole new market on your own. So that's the core of the thesis that we look after, and that can go across sector. Space and defense remains one of our major focus area, where we, together with Raphael, we run the Kicksky as a space focus accelerator as well. We exchange a lot. But on the apart from that, we also invest in life sciences, clean energy, cybersecurity, also future of compute. So all these different areas that we very actively look into. We have foot presence between US, like SF, London, Zurich, and India. So these are the places where you'll find our team, but we are happy to look globally. So yeah, that's what we do. As an example of portfolio, we have one deal together with Raphael in India, Milasius Space, which is building propulsion for satellite. We were first check in Ethereal X, which is building 24-ton fully reusable rocket. They were also one of our quite successful investments. So these are example of different portfolio within a space that we have. Yeah, and that's all about me. Personally, I'm a physicist turned founder, now turned a VC. So that's...
Thank you. My name is Imre Hild. I'm the CEO of Óbuda Univenture Capital. It's a university-based venture capital fund, the first one of its kind in the Carpathian Basin, which is kind of larger Hungary. We invest in technologies anywhere from 50K to 750K, obviously early stage technologies. We look at deep tech, any kind of machine learning, machine vision related startups. So far, we've invested in robotics, medical devices, and we are obviously also open to space and defense. Many of those applicants who applied for funding so far, and they were coming from this area, somehow failed to follow through. Probably it's because of their university engagements, but we are trying really hard to try to connect academia with the industry, and we have altogether 30 million euros. So we still have about 60% of the fund available. So we are looking for investment opportunities day and night.
Thank you for this introduction. And Imre, the reason why I asked you to introduce yourself last, because you are some kind of odd one out, at least so far, because so far you haven't made any investments into space and defense. And I wanted to ask your opinion about what do you see as an investor about investing in space and defense. Maybe 1 year ago we have been talking about this topic, but very shortly. And you also mentioned that maybe it's a hype. Definitely there is a hype around. The numbers are booming when it comes to space investments. We have also heard earlier on in the plenary session some numbers. How do you see currently space and defense investments as per your knowledge currently?
Kind of a peculiar or strange comparison is with AI. That I think both in space tech and in AI we are in a very, very early stage. So much of the infrastructure is currently being built out, and I think sort of the end of the rainbow that everybody seems to see, and where the obviously the major mother lode is, I think that's still a little bit too far. Our role is definitely not in infrastructure, not in hardware development or any kind of development that is in a very, very long term, 10, 15 years. It seems that we are more focusing on software, and there are many successful software projects who are applying to us, who are working with ESA, who are thinking about somehow commercializing their software solutions and cybersecurity solutions. So that seems to be the area where I think realistically we can be involved. And again, 750K, it's hard to pronounce that kind of a sum in this industry segment. But I think that software, and couple that with Hungarian ingenuity, I think that we can get somewhere pretty soon when it comes to adding to the Hungarian representation in space.
Yes, and thank you. And Raphael, you have been doing E2MC since 2027, if I'm not wrong. And since then, what kind of changes you have experienced? So how was it that time to invest in space, and say about yourself that I am a space tech or space domain investor, and how is it today? So what are the, say, one major or three top insights from this last 8 years?
Yeah, just to be clear, I mean, 2017 is when I started investing my own money, so there was no fund for another few years. This is when I personally, my first investment personally was in SpaceX. So let's start there. 2017, and this may be hard to believe these days. So one of the things I ended up doing was, for some people who are very close to SpaceX and sort of remarket some of their shares via SPVs, they asked me to help in this marketing effort to try to convince wealthy families, wealthy individuals to invest in SpaceX. That was incredibly hard. Like, you had to beat people over the head and they still wouldn't invest. They're still like, what is this Mars stuff and like space, and we have no idea. That's obviously quite different now, right? Back then SpaceX was valued at 20 billion, which is not cheap by any. Well, sorry, I think it was cheap then, but it's not a low absolute valuation by any standard. Obviously now we're like somewhere north of 400 billion, right? So the rest is history. The Starship successful 11th test flight last night, for those of you who watched. So we are still, I believe, very early on, but there is now, when we started as E2MC as a space investment fund, there was only really a handful. Now it's still only a handful, but relatively a few more. You had maybe one or two analysts and bankers at Wall Street banks covering space. Now there's more of that. Now there's just more space startups now. Many startups have moved along, grown quick. Obviously, many fell away, but some that were successful have become much bigger, right? As I said, we even had IPOs. So that's one. So the sector is developing more, but I still think this is very early. I very often compare space as a deep tech sector to something like biotech. Biotech basically started in the 1970s, and it took like a few decades to become really big. And now we have like thousands of biotech specialized funds, right? And we still have like maybe, I don't know, 20 specialized space funds or so. So we still have some work in front of us. I'll give you one other thing that changed in my mind, which is relevant to early stage investors like us. Imre was talking about the infrastructure, building out the infrastructure. So I think actually a lot of infrastructure now has been built. Like, thanks to something like SpaceX, you can go to space extremely regularly, economically, securely, even more or less easily, right? Which wasn't always the case. We have many satellite constellations, many types of sensors in space, many types of radios in space. There's actually, like now, several companies are working on replacement space stations. There's actually a fair amount of infrastructure out there. As early stage investors, we're actually moving away from the infrastructure part now. And we're increasingly asking ourselves, what kind of applications can we run on top of that infrastructure, using that infrastructure? And this is where we get to things like in-space manufacturing and so forth. But this is an early stage investor perspective where my job is to look 10 years into the future at least.
So thank you. Now we have a kind of insight in the time series. And now I turn Ankit to you because you are traveling quite intensively. So we are popping up in different parts of the world. How do you see these regional differences when it comes to space and defense investments? So how different is India? You are originally from India, moved to Switzerland, have your degree from there. But we have been talking about. You spent the last 2 months in San Francisco. I don't know where your next trip will lead you, but how do you see those regional and differences on a global perspective? So how much US, I don't know, it's advanced, what are the main advantages, for example, India, and how do you see our region?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. So, yeah. When people ask me where do you live, it's just hard to describe at times. Same is true for Raphael as well. So when it comes to geography, see, we have to still understand one thing, picking up from the last conversations, right? While we are all talking about that now spaces became a mainstream and all, but a lot of time the people who are active like us who are in the industry, we know that the biggest change that has happened, that mass media started to get more attention of it. When you looked at the real work, there is some changes, but it's still a long way to go, right? Like the people who actually invest, as Raphael said, like probably 20 funds which are focused on space, right? Globally. I mean, that's nothing, right? When it comes to that. So because the industry is still very niche, I still believe pretty much that more or less this entire industry has to be still very global. Because, of course, there is a defense angle and sovereignty is being talked about, and that's why there is a lot of regional fragmentation is happening. Totally from a commercial point of view, I'm not sure if that's the best thing to happen to the industry, because eventually this is a small industry, we have to understand, right? There are a handful of people who do this business, and roughly if you walk into 5-6 conferences around the world, you more or less know everybody. In this industry. So it's a very niche industry. It's a premium industry. But because it's a small industry, it doesn't mean that it's a low value industry, because whatever you do is a normally high price. So it's a premium industry. Still a lot of business to be done. But because it's so small in terms of the number of people involved and number of companies involved, we need to be looking at the more from a global point of view. So now when asking, coming back to your question, whenever any market geographically looked upon, we have to look into different lenses. What are we talking about? Because, of course, different geography is looked upon in terms of market that they have, or capital availability they have, or talent availability they have, right? These are the core 3 differences you will basically end up identifying. And I would like to answer in these pillars. So from a market perspective, at least I would like that way, and I would like that more and more we stay so. That is more we remain global. When it comes to defense angle, then of course there will be some barriers or some firewalls we have to create in different countries. But definitely from a market perspective, more global we are, better for the entire ecosystem, right? So that's where we don't normally any startup we invest in, we try to always look, can they sell cross market? We hardly invest in any startup which is coming totally pure play from a sovereign interest, that this, let's say this technology already exists in US and we are making a European version of it, right? Can be a great business. You may have a great relationship with the local government and you may end up selling that, but it's still too risky for us as an early stage investor, because we never know how these policies will change, you know. Today there is a inward looking policy and by the time this technology is out in the market, it's already 5-6 years, right? What happens in the geopolitics, then we don't know, right? So we still have to look very global, that they have at least value to add in a global perspective. So that's the point. So irrespective whatever geography we look into, that's the first thing that we normally try to look. But the other 2 areas is very different every geography. That is comes first and foremost risk capital. And I think that's the, the easiest answer is that highest amount of risk capital exists in US. And that's the reason even us or anybody investing in other parts, at some point we end up collaborating with the US investor. Should it change? Of course, we need more diversification. We need more and more people being there. Are we there yet? Unfortunately not, right? So every reason is trying, but when you start to try to put the risk capital, first starting point is the early stage capital. More or less, we are kind of okay with the early stage capital now. Every reason have some sort of a small fund who can do some sort of early stage investing, but it's still a long way to go for the growth capital. And the whole idea of US, I mean, when I spend time in San Francisco, I mean, we have co-investors who are like actually Japanese CVC operating out of SF. So if I want to close a Japanese CVC, I normally need to be in SF, right? Which is as crazy as it sounds, right? So risk capital, especially in a mid-growth stage, Series A onward, still remains pretty much focused on US. And that's why having your US presence or as a startup, you having that exposure to that market or having the investor on your cap table who can open those doors is still very crucial for you, right? So that's on the capital side. But when it comes to talent, then that is the part which I'm most excited about, because every region has certain things to offer. I mean, when we work with India, the Indian talent is one of the most amazing talent in a space that we find. That doesn't mean there are other people, not other country who have the same talent, but when you consider the capital efficiency these guys bring on a table with the experience combined, it's the most amazing market for us, right? Because I always joke that I would rather bet my money more on a ISRO engineer, which is the Indian Space Agency, than from a NASA engineer. Because though, of course, ISRO has a great track record of delivering quite a lot of good, successful space mission, but of course, NASA has worked much more, and the NASA guy will be way more experienced. But the difference is that NASA guys know how to work with budget. In a startup, we need the guys who know how to work without budget. And that's what Indian Space Agency was known for. You know, you might have seen sometimes those famous picture of like them carrying a rocket on a bicycle, right? Or they were one of the first rockets in India was transported using a bullock cart, actually, literally were the bulls driving that entire thing. So they literally normally don't have the mindset of spending for what you don't need. You know, they can work out of a most trashed hangar as long as whatever is needed, you're going to put their money. And that's the mindset from a startup point of view is very, very interesting. And that talent is a quite value. And last time also when I was here in this conference, I brought this up, that Hungary can play the same role, right? Because talent here can also, because if you start to always look from a perspective that, okay, this is how they do it in Germany, so I'll use the same fancy way of doing things. That may not be your strength. So we have to play with our strength. So any emerging country, entire CE region, or even Hungary, should look from that lens that what sort of efficiency of the talent we can bring. Because talent are there, right? Because there could be people here who are studying. I mean, you're on a university here. And also the people who go out of Hungary and they are willing to come back to build something here, right? So if you can build a business here where you work with the right capital efficiency and have that mindset that you provide the same quality, don't compromise on the quality at all, right? But it's still not unnecessarily spending in the things that is not needed, then I think you can do a quite well job. So talent remains the most interesting, where I think every region has a role to play.
Yes, thank you. So I know that there are students also in the room, so please, hands up. So, okay, there are plenty of them, okay. And I will have a question. Just let me go first to Dom, because you are now wearing two hats, but now I am asking this question from you as an entrepreneur, space tech entrepreneur. How could you convince the investors to invest in your company? Was it easy, hard? And what do you expect, or how is your current runway, and when do you need to raise funds next time?
Oh man, this is funny. So even though I'm an angel investor in a VC, I'm not raising external capital for my company. We've invested our own capital, which we are in a fortunate position to be able to have. And we've scored a couple of early stage development grants from a couple of different entities. And we're now focused on getting pilot contracts, so basic revenue. So one way to do fundraising is to prove that whatever you do is worth putting into orbit. That is the space heritage that I spoke about in the other
Yes, you have been talking about.
You were there. So do not, for young students, if you're in engineering and you have a chance to launch a small sat into space, go for it. It might sound very basic, but it actually gives you a very interesting mindset of what you might not know or what you might not be aware about how space launch works. So I always encourage starting there. Another colleague of ours, a Polish gentleman, Lukasz, is putting together European Mars rover challenge every year. Even though those rovers that students build will never go to Mars, they're also very beneficial from a student's point of view. And one of the iSpace engineers who just crashed a rover into the moon told me that he would hire anybody who's built a fake rover before over somebody who's just did an engineering degree. And that's why, because you also encounter problems that you're not aware of while you're going through. So I say, build stuff, break stuff, and get somebody to pay for part of it, and then raise money. It will be a more pleasant journey, because otherwise, if you first raise and promise a lot, the clock starts ticking, and your investors within a pretty short timeline come back to you and ask you for a return. And if you don't deliver a return, you don't deliver revenue, you'll have some unpleasant conversations. And whereas the people, if this was room when it was in the US, my answer would be slightly more nuanced. I would say that first raise money and then find more money. In Europe, we're not so fortunate to burn a lot of money and then go and ask for more money in some cases. So that cultural aspect means that we have to be more frugal. And just like ISRO rides rockets on bicycles and carts, we have to do similar things. And I'm reading a book called When Heavens Went on Sale, which I recommend for all the students in the room as well, because it talks about the early days of SpaceX and Rocket Labs. The Rocket Labs engineers were also doing crazy things and just like exploding stuff in the basement of the lab where people could have gotten hurt just because they didn't have access to better facilities. So be frugal. And there's a final thing I'll say, there's this funny French word bricolage, which is tinkering around with what you have to build what you can. And I think that the European founders should definitely embrace the bricolage mentality and try to build as much as possible. Maybe I'll stop here. Did that answer your question?
Yes, something similar that I heard, and I also follow that better done than perfect. Before I go towards with Imre and Raphael about talent development, evangelization, because Imre is representing University VC, Raphael is doing the Space Business Podcast, but let me turn to some of the students who raised their hands, because maybe it's better that you ask your questions when it comes to talent development than I do, and just let me stand up and go with the mic, and who would like to ask a question? Okay, there is, you have been the quickest. Okay, if you can provide him the mic, then it's better. And please also just say your name and where are you coming from.
Thank you for the microphone. I'm Adrián Viplak from Siófok. I'm a high school student, and at first hand I would like to ask Imre about what's possibility in your university. Do you have any possibility for? We would like to start a startup in defense sector, in aerospace especially. What possibilities do you have at your university around aerospace?
So it's then a reverse pitch, right?
Yeah, reverse pitch.
Startups pitching to VCs, but VCs pitching to startups.
Yeah, we have a lot of resources. Obviously, we have 7 faculties. 6 of them are technical. As I mentioned, robotics, but I should mention the John von Neumann faculty, which is on the IT department, and many consider it one of the largest and strongest departments within the university. Besides that, when it comes to innovation, there are multiple organizations within the university focusing on innovation, including us. And the university has more than 300 labs where very obviously various technologies can be experimented with. We also have 3 science parks, one in Zsámbék, another one in Kaposvár, and the third one in Székesfehérvár, all focusing on one particular domain. So I don't want to take up too much of the time. Please come and talk to me later, and I'm going to details about it. But the bottom line is that we are open to high school students also, and we are open to anyone, not only university students, to work on technologies. The only thing that matters to us is there has to be some Hungarian element in it. And in this case, I see that there is. So we can move forward. Obviously, 750K is the top limit for us. But the good thing is that our funder is a fund of funds which has about 50 million euros, so we can actually go further if need be. Typically, it's not the money that is necessary. Typically, it's more competence, leadership skills, and all the others. But I will explain it to you later.
Thank you very much.
Let's congratulate him. Being a high school student, he showed up here and asking this question. So
yes,
thank you for showing up.
Great initiative, very entrepreneurial.
Yes, more
That's
questions?
what we want as a young generation to show up.
Okay, please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Tiger, and I'm studying at Obuda University right now in engineering management. So my questions that I want to ask is, if a student like us want to get involved in space and defense industry, what should be the first step that we what should be our first step?
Maybe I can answer this question. So I'm also guest lecturing at Obuda University. I'm having a new space economy course. So you are welcome the next semester during the spring. But although it's a postgraduate course, but there is a coalition of Hungarian universities called Unispace. And I also see other students from this Unispace program over here. And in this Unispace program, you can select different disciplines: space science, space engineering, space policy, and space nutrition. So this is the current, let's say, landscape, what you can study at a Hungarian university. But of course, there are individual universities: Budapest University of Technology, Miskolc University, who is having space engineering, aerospace engineering, bachelor's, master's, and there is more classical earth sciences, astronomy at most of the, let's say, general universities.
So I'm going to add to on the education front, since Peter forgot, even though he's wearing the pin, Peter and I are both alumni of the International Space University. That sounds made up, but it actually exists. It has existed for like over 30 years. And they have several programs, but one program is called the Space Studies program. It's a 2-month, extremely intense summer program where you kind of get to learn a little bit about every discipline in space, whether that's engineering or life sciences or astronomy, whatever. And it'll also give you one of the, I think, best networks in the space sector. So that has kickstarted a lot of people.
For example, mine as well. So I have been to the ISU SSP last year in Houston. Okay, we will have a few more minutes on questions, but please, yes, Dom, go ahead.
If I was a student and I could go back, I would dedicate my summers to interning with space companies and just learning how an early stage company works, whether it's with engineering department overseeing and carrying screws to them, or whether it's shadowing a founder and taking notes for him and bringing coffee, whatever it is, just spending time around people who are investing their own labor, sweat, tears, and other bodily fluids into making something run is a worthy endeavor, and you can learn a lot from it, I think.
Yes, and then I would like to ask who is in the audience from a space or defense company who also accepts or receives student projects or applications. Is there? Okay, just higher, please, your hands. So the students, please go and meet those people for internships and the different kind of programs. Thank you.
I mean, you can also reach out to me. We have a bunch of portfolio company. They always look for interns, so we can always put you through some of this.
That's also true. I wanted to turn to Raphael because I mentioned that you are running this space business podcast. You can also Google for it on the Spotify, and the latest episode was episode number 150. Now I checked just while you were delivering your presentation, and this also gives you an insight in the future, talking to these founders and different space nerds or people who just entered the space domain. And I wanted to ask, why are you doing this? Because it takes lots of time, lots of efforts. Okay, it brings you attention and So your name is also recognized through this, but I'm sure that you have much higher purpose with this.
So it's a lot of fun. And so there's a lot of, I mean, these are usually people I should talk to anyway, like important space entrepreneurs in a professional function. Sometimes they're earlier stage entrepreneurs, and then I could conceivably invest in them. Or even if they're later stage entrepreneurs, then we could maybe still invest in them, or they could be partners for our early stage companies. So many of these people I should talk to anyway. And so the difference is I hit the record button, we cut out some confidential stuff, but it's actually quite efficient. But no, the reason I started this originally, which I'm not sure has worked so far, is to actually. We always say we're like a non-technical podcast, and you don't have to know anything about the space sector. The original purpose was to try to drag more people into the space sector, because as I think Anki just pointed out, at the moment you can go to space conferences. I always joke it's about 2,000 people are like the same people, and they're slowly adding people, but not fast enough. And we can't build a thriving space economy with that. It just doesn't work. We need many more people in space. And it also goes back to something I was saying earlier, that space, in my mind, is now moving, at least at the early stage, from infrastructure towards applications. So what is the effect of that? Infrastructure, that's actually typically what you think about as rocket science, because people are building stuff like rockets or satellites. When we're talking about applications, it's actually using space for something. And typically, the customers are actually from a non-space sector, okay? So I'll just give you a couple of easy examples. It could be that, you're using satellite data, satellite imagery for agriculture or insurance, okay? And so suddenly, it's not enough that you're a space engineer, aeroastro engineer. It's actually arguably even more important that if you have a startup in that field, that you understand the end customer in the agriculture or insurance sector. Another much funkier example I already mentioned in space manufacturing is we're now really starting to opening up the intersection of space and biotech. I could talk hours about that, but it's basically about using the unique things that microgravity allows you to do things we just can't do on Earth. And there's many examples of that, and we know that because we've conducted thousands of experiments in space over the years. But now it starts to make commercial sense. But again, for these use cases, it's not enough. Arguably, you shouldn't even be a space engineer. You should be, if you want to do something space biotech, you should be a biotech person. Your education, your background should actually be in biotech. And you probably have someone on the team who sort of understands the space stuff, so they know kind of like what hardware you can use, when and with whom you can fly to space, and so forth. So the point here being is, the more we go in that direction of space applications which are serving non-space sectors, this is only going to work if we bring in more people from those other sectors and explain why space is important. And there's historical precedence for that, so I'm going to date myself, but I'm old enough to remember when the commercial internet really came up. I was at university. And the first few, or many of the first internet entrepreneurs was computer science people. It kind of made sense because they're the people who knew about the internet, right? So like Mark Andreessen is a really famous example. It then took a few years for people from non-computer science backgrounds to understand that the internet could be really useful for other stuff. But many of those people then ended up building very significant companies. And that's what we still need to do in space. And that's, that was the original purpose of the podcast, was really to try to bring in more people who are not yet in the space sector.
Okay, so we have been covering quite a lot of topics within the investment life cycles, except for exits. So let's spend a few minutes on exits. First question to Imre. So you have been in the Hungarian space and investors ecosystem for 15 plus years. So I've been working with successful founders who made nice exits. And what is the role of exits in an economy? So how those people who have been successful made an exit and contributed. The same questions to Dom, because in the Baltic countries we have seen nice space mafias coming out from huge success stories, even without exiting. And so those questions to two of you, and also we'll have related questions to Raphael and also to Ankit. So, but Imre, then Dom.
Yeah, I think the very important role of the exit, well, for the entrepreneur it's obvious, but for the economy is that the flywheel effect can start to kick in. So many of those people who create these successful ventures that they exit, what do they do with the capital that they receive? Well, very often they invest into themselves and they invest in other businesses, and that can actually generate a flywheel and a multiplicator effect, which actually starts to impact the entire economy of that given country in a very significant way. My favorite example is Estonia, where in a city of Tallinn, 450,000 people, they already have, well, it depends on how you count it, but 10 to 15 unicorns, which is just not possible, based on demographics. It is possible based on the very positive effect of the entrepreneurs who generated some money with some of the early successes, Skype and the like. And then now they already have an entire mafia, the famous Estonian startup mafia, that is actually built on trust and built on common understanding how to build a data-driven enterprise. And that is I think that's a very important effect of the startup economy on the other part of the economy, the old school economy. So exits are those moments when much of the effort and much of the value creation actually turns into cash, turns into distributable income, and can be shared back into given economy. And I think that's where I would like to see more positive examples in Hungary, just to stick with our country, that these entrepreneurs should be taking the charge and basically saying, okay, I know this about this industry. And these are the major pain points where some of the startups should be supported, be it space, be it any other part of the economy and other industries. That kind of role modeling, that kind of showing a positive example to the younger generation is crucial. It turns out that most of the ecosystems, I've been studying the ecosystems for the past 15 years, most of the successful ecosystems show this, that there is a positive example that younger entrepreneurs, the next generation, can follow, and they are actually encouraged to follow these good examples. There are positive physical spaces, and they are connected internationally. It's not enough to be connected among each other. That's kind of natural, local connections, but the international connections and international visibility is key, and that is what I think, based on my experience in Serbia, Slovakia, and other smaller Eastern European countries, that's what we are not that good at. There's a huge talent, as I mentioned. There is a huge amount of talent. I think it is undersold. So the Hungarian startups are typically complaining that in Hungary they are not appreciated as much as outside. And it's simple. They are compared to a different set in Amsterdam or in London than they are in Budapest. So I would say that exits actually create a kind of a big check mark on this part of the economy, and gives courage and hope to many other younger entrepreneurs.
And hopefully angel investors.
So Imre covered the idea of ecosystems and talked about Estonia a bit. Lithuania is similar. Basically, the idea of an ecosystem is how can somebody who has encountered an important problem find somebody who has solved that particular problem before with the least amount of money and least amount of phone calls. And the ecosystem works when you can call another founder and say, yo, I'm dealing with this. You dealt with this last year or 2 years ago. Can you help? And the ecosystems emerge from people who have done some interesting stuff. And I'll give you a personal example. So Raphael was unfortunate enough to share a 2-hour car drive with me this morning. And even though we met in April at one of those conferences that Ankit was talking about, where all of these 2,000 people mingle, we haven't spoken since, but we knew general updates about one another because a bunch of our friends talked to both of us. And one of the gentlemen that we brought up is named Linas, who's a co-founder of Nano Avionics, which is a small sat developer that was acquired by a Norwegian defense prime called Kongsberg a couple of years ago in the deal is undisclosed, but let's say 8-digit deal, which is pretty good for the Baltic states. Out of that company called Nano Avionics, 3 main Lithuanian space companies emerged. Linas is now an angel investor who invests in most of those companies and also invested in a couple of VC funds elsewhere. And he alone is responsible for half of our national science diplomacy, I would say, through him going to conferences, meeting people and drinking with people. But this is the effect of a successful exit. And one thing I'll say that most of the US venture capital has arisen because people crowdsourced or crowd-pooled money together to invest into something. Most of the venture capital in continental Europe emerged because European Union ran a tender and a PowerPoint won that tender. And so most of the VCs we have on this side of the world are unfortunately not operators. And I don't know what Peter did, but you have quite a number of people who build companies and have business experience in the same panel. So I think the point is that if you can turn to an operator VC in Europe, it will help you guide your journey a bit, and it will also connect you with people who had exits and will teach you how to do it again, I suppose.
Yes, Ankit, I also turn to you, and so we have been signing this MOU back in March in India. It's with Infotér and Kicksky Space Tech Accelerator also to help and promote Hungarian Central and Eastern European entities entering the Indian space market, as well as help Indian space companies to come to the Europe and access ESA, EU, and NATO funds as well. But back to the original question, few words on exits.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of them already covered, and we can just speak from the example. When I said, I was giving example of Silicon Valley, one of the things that you have to look at the pattern, most of the Silicon Valley ecosystem is built around the people who have done an exit. I mean, you know, famous PayPal mafia, or even to start with, like the entire VC industry started with like Fairchild Semiconductor mafia that basically started this entire thing. So basically, this really helps, and that also translates in other countries as well. I can speak from the example of India. You know, now Indian startup ecosystem is like third largest in the world, around 20 billion a year being invested every year. But I remember my first startup experience in India, because I've been bootstrapping business since I'm like 17-year-old. So I didn't know what venture capital means. You know, like first time I got first startup, which was like in 2013, funded by a VC. And I was like, oh, people give you money to build business? No interest rate, because literally when I borrowed money from market, it was in India like 3% a month. You know, that's the rate that I borrowed money to build my businesses. You know, that was a mafia, exactly. So what happened in India, basically, there was this, like when I mean, also the startup I was part of, that was an edtech startup back in my days in education. We had $1 million in funding, and I was one of the quite decently known guy in the education industry. And I was not the founder, but I came as the founding team. And they got me attracted by knowing that, oh, 1 million funding is there. That was a big amount back then, you know, to think today it's not the case. What changed? Actually, in 2014, there was a company called Flipkart in India. They started in 2008. And they were bought by Walmart for 16 billion. And that was during the period when I was still part of that startup. That entire thing has turned the entire Indian story upside down. Now, people who came out of that startup have built multiple unicorns. So there are like probably around 110, 120 unicorns in India. And a huge portion of them you can map to one or two those large exits that happen in very early stages, right? Those guys came either as a founder or they were the founding investor. Even one of the guy who was basically involved there and then later is now one of the most famous investor, was first investor in India's one of the famous or like very good rocket startup, right? So not only translated from, let's say, a D2C, it also fueled other industry within the country itself, right? That's something I've seen even first person. So that's the part, because eventually it's a very basic thing, right? Investors make money when somehow you do an exit. Now you do an IPO, you do an acquisition, you do secondary. But unless that money is coming back, the money feels like it's a philanthropy. And that's unfortunate. A lot of time in Europe, when we are discussing about a startup investment, it is always like a philanthropic lens, it feels like. Government should invest in a startup. Government should promote a startup. We should invest because we are creating ecosystem, which is great. But it will never create a flywheel unless actually people make serious money out of it. Because real flywheel comes in when your neighbor who invested in a startup probably $100,000 or probably $50,000, and now suddenly it's like worth 10, 20 million after a very good exit that happened, then you feel a FOMO, like, oh, I should also do that. How the hell you made money? You were a guy like me, and suddenly you are a very rich guy, right? This is what you see in Silicon Valley day in, day out, right? Every second person, not every second person, I mean, people lose money also quite a lot in the startup, by the way, not to solist on that area, but you will have more and more example to see. And that example comes first and foremost to the other investors who see that you made money, so how can I make? So they start to take more risk. Of course, the experience you both already covered, so I don't want to say that, because if you have been, like as a operator investor, me being in that shoe, right? It's not only that I can help you and I can guide you what to do, not. The best investor you need, who are the people when something goes wrong, how they react to that situation, There you'll get plenty of investors who are like cheering for you, putting a lot of LinkedIn posts about you when you're going success after success and raising next round after next round, their money is increasing. But in the kind of industry we are in, things go wrong. There might be 2 years where nothing is moving. And then if somebody stands behind you, that's the real investor you need. And somebody who have been in that shoe before, they know that it's okay. Sometimes 2 years can be bad, still you can bounce back, right? Which is very hard to relate with for the people who, I don't want to say that word, but we just had the whole theoretical model over a PowerPoint while building their fund, So that's part I wanted to cover. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for all these insights, and I could sum up this as that the time to invest in space and defense is now. It's also true for the investors as well for the entrepreneurs, current or future entrepreneurs. We see a growing trend which seems to be established when it comes to technology. Therefore, dear audience, if you have any requests towards business angels, turn to Dom. If you would like to work with Space Tech Accelerator or have a global insight in space and defense investments, turn to Ankit. If you are local to Hungary and would like to have an investor from Hungary, then turn to Imre. And if you have a nice story to be covered in the Space Business podcast, then turn please to Raphael. And with these words, I would like to say thank you for the panelists as well as for the audience. The gentlemen stay for 10 more minutes, and unfortunately I will need to rob them because the one-on-one speed dating sessions will start at 4, just very close in another room. But feel you have their names; they are quite open to get contacted over LinkedIn. So feel free to turn towards them and mention that you met them at Infotér Space and Defense conference. Here in this room, in half an hour, we will have another panel discussion: international business, how you can grow your network internationally. In a regional context as well. And please don't forget, 6 p.m. there will be the ESA, European Space Agency's 50th anniversary event in the lunch tent where you have had your registration. Small present is waiting for everyone. So at 6 p.m. please join that session where we can commemorate ESA's 50th and Hungary's 10 years in the European Space Agency. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for the panelists.
Thank you for bringing us together.